The following compilation features unsettling and spine-chilling tales sourced from Reddit's horror communities. Reader discretion is strongly advised. These narratives may contain graphic descriptions, psychological distress, and themes that could unsettle sensitive individuals. Proceed with caution, as immersion into these eerie stories may provoke fear, unease, and sleep disturbances. Enter this realm of Reddit's creepy horror stories at your own risk, as the line between reality and the macabre may blur within these chilling narratives. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as I shuffled through the stack of applications on my desk. Another day. Another pile of desperate people hoping to secure some fragment of security in an uncertain world. I'd been working at Everlast Life Insurance for over a decade, and the faces all blurred together after a while. Young families, middle-aged divorcees, elderly folks grasping at one last chance to leave something behind. I'd seen it all. Or so I thought. It was late on a Friday afternoon when his file crossed my desk. Most of my co-workers had already left for the weekend, their vacant cubicles forming a maze of shadows in the dimming office. I should have been out the door myself, but something made me pause as I reached for my coat. Maybe it was the worn edges of the manila folder, or the faded photograph paperclipped to the front. Whatever it was, I found myself sinking back into my chair, flipping open the file of one Mr. Ezekiel Thorne. The photo showed a withered old man, his skin like crumpled parchment stretched over sharp bones. But it was his eyes that gave me pause, pale blue and piercing. They seemed to stare right through the camera and into my soul. I shivered involuntarily and turned to the application itself. Ezekiel Thorne, age 92, no living relatives, former occupation, mortician, current address, 13 Ravens Lane. As I scanned his medical history, my eyebrows crept steadily higher. This man should have been dead 10 times over. Heart attacks, cancer, strokes. He'd survived it all, and now here he was, at the ripe old age of 92, applying for a substantial life insurance policy. I'll admit, a small part of me was impressed. The old codger had beaten the odds time and time again, but the larger part, the part that had kept me employed at Everlast all these years, saw only dollar signs and risk. There was no way the company would approve this. The potential payout far outweighed any premiums we could reasonably charge. With a sigh, I reached for the large red denied stamp. It was just business. After all, nothing personal. As the stamp came down with a dull thud, a chill ran down my spine. For a split second, I could have sworn I saw those pale blue eyes staring at me from the shadows of my cubicle. I whipped around, heart pounding, but there was nothing there. Just the empty office and the ever-present hum of the fluorescent lights. Get it together, I told myself. You're working too late. Time to go home. I hurriedly shoved Mr. Thorne's file into the outgoing mail and grabbed my coat. As I rushed out of the office, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone or something was watching me. The weight of that gaze seemed to follow me all the way to my car. That night, I dreamed of pale blue eyes and the smell of formaldehyde. The next week passed in a blur of routine. I processed applications, attended meetings, and did my best to forget about Ezekiel Thorne. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't shake the lingering unease that had taken root in the pit of my stomach. It was exactly 1 week later when I heard the news. I was in the break room, pouring my third cup of coffee, when I overheard 2 co-workers gossiping by the vending machine. Did you hear about that old man who died last night? The one who lived in that creepy house on Ravens Lane? I flouncy, coffee mug halfway to my lips. Oh yeah. What was his name? Thornton. Thorne. Ezekiel Thorne, I whispered, my voice barely audible. My co-workers turned to look at me, startled. Yeah, that's it. How did you know? I couldn't answer. The room was spinning, the fluorescent lights suddenly too bright. I mumbled some excuse and stumbled back to my cubicle, collapsing into my chair. It was just a coincidence, I told myself. Old people die all the time. It had nothing to do with me or the denied application. But as I sat there, trying to calm my racing heart, I couldn't help but remember those piercing blue eyes, and I could have sworn I caught a whiff of formaldehyde drifting through the recycled office air. That night, I tossed and turned, unable to sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Mr. Thorne's wrinkled face, his eyes accusing and full of malice. When I finally drifted off in the early hours of the morning, my dreams were haunted by the sound of a pen scratching endlessly across paper, filling out an application that would never be approved. I awoke with a start, drenched in sweat. As my eyes adjusted to the darkness, I realized with growing horror that the scratching sound hadn't stopped. It was coming from just outside my bedroom door. Trembling, I reached for the bedside lamp. As light flooded the room, the scratching abruptly ceased. I held my breath, straining to hear any movement in the hallway beyond. For a long moment, there was only silence. Then, slowly, deliberately, something slid under my door. A manila folder, its edges worn and familiar. With shaking hands, I picked it up and opened it. Inside was a single sheet of paper. At the top, in spidery handwriting, were the words life insurance application. The rest of the page was blank, save for 2 words stamped in red at the bottom: claim denied. I let out a strangled cry and threw the folder across the room. This couldn't be happening. It was just a bad dream, a hallucination brought on by stress and lack of sleep. I squeezed my eyes shut, willing myself to wake up. When I opened them again, the folder was gone, but the faint smell of formaldehyde lingered in the air, and I knew with sickening certainty that this was only the beginning. The next morning, I called in sick to work. I couldn't face the office, couldn't bear to look at another life insurance application. I spent the day huddled in my apartment, jumping at every creak and shadow. By nightfall, I had almost convinced myself that it had all been in my imagination. Almost. As darkness fell, I found myself drawn to my computer. With trembling fingers, I typed Ezekiel Thorne into the search bar. What I found chilled me to the bone. The first result was an obituary, dated just 2 days ago. But it wasn't the date that caught my attention, it was the photo. The man in the picture was undoubtedly Ezekiel Thorne, but he looked wrong. His skin was waxy, his posture too stiff, and his eyes, those pale blue eyes that had haunted my dreams, were open and staring directly at the camera. I slammed my laptop shut, my heart pounding. That couldn't be right. No funeral home would publish a photo like that, would they? A soft thud from the hallway made me jump. I flouncy, listening intently. Another thud, closer this time. Then another. It sounded like footsteps, slow, dragging footsteps approaching my door. I held my breath, praying it was just a neighbor. The footsteps stopped right outside my apartment. For a long moment, there was only silence. Then came the knock. 3 slow, deliberate raps that seemed to echo through my entire body. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. Maybe if I stayed perfectly still, whoever or whatever was out there would go away. Another knock, louder this time, and then a voice, dry and raspy like dead leaves skittering across pavement. I know you're in there, Mr. Insurance Man. We have unfinished business. I bit back a scream. This wasn't happening. It couldn't be happening. You denied my claim, the voice continued, seeping under the door like a noxious gas. But I'm not finished yet. Not by a long shot. The doorknob began to turn, metal scraping against metal. I watched in horror as it slowly rotated, defying the deadbolt that I knew was securely in place. Just as the door began to creak open, I snapped out of my paralysis. I ran to my bedroom, slamming and locking the door behind me. I could hear shuffling footsteps in the living room, getting closer. You can't hide from death forever, the voice called out, now just outside my bedroom. Sooner or later, everyone's policy comes due. I backed away from the door, looking wildly around for an escape route. The window caught my eye. I was only on the 3rd floor. I could make that jump if I had to. The bedroom doorknob began to turn. I didn't hesitate. I flung open the window and climbed out onto the narrow ledge. The cool night air hit me like a slap, clearing some of the panic from my mind. What was I doing? This was insane. I was 3 stories up, clinging to the side of a building, because I thought a dead man was trying to get into my apartment. I slowly turned back towards the window, ready to climb back inside and face whatever madness awaited me. But as I peered through the glass, my blood ran cold. Ezekiel Thorne stood in my bedroom, his pale blue eyes locked on mine. His skin was grey and mottled, his suit the same one he'd been buried in. As I watched in horror, he raised one withered hand and beckoned to me. I lost my balance, my foot slipping off the ledge. For one heart-stopping moment, I teetered on the edge of oblivion. Then I was falling, the ground rushing up to meet me. I woke up in the hospital 3 days later, multiple fractures. The doctors told me, but I was lucky to be alive. As I lay there, trying to piece together what had happened, a nurse came in with a small package. "This was left for you at the front desk," she said, placing it on my bedside table. With a sense of dread, I opened the package. Inside was a life insurance policy from Everlast. My own company had apparently taken out a policy on me without my knowledge. And there, at the bottom of the page, was a familiar red stamp. Claim denied. Ugh. I started to laugh, the sound bordering on hysterical. The nurse looked at me with concern, but I couldn't stop, because there, in the corner of the room, I could see a pair of pale blue eyes watching me from the shadows. This was far from over. The next few weeks were a blur of hospital rooms and physical therapy. I told myself that what I'd experienced was just a vivid hallucination, brought on by stress and lack of sleep. The fall from my window, a moment of sleepwalking. Nothing more. I almost believed it. But every night, as the hospital grew quiet and the shadows lengthened, I could feel those eyes on me. Sometimes I'd catch a glimpse of a withered figure at the end of the hallway, or hear the shuffle of feet outside my door. The night staff whispered about the smell of formaldehyde that seemed to linger in my room, no matter how much they cleaned. I was released from the hospital on a grey, drizzly Tuesday. As the taxi pulled up to my apartment building, I felt a surge of panic. I couldn't go back there, couldn't face those rooms where I'd seen him. "Keep driving," I told the cabbie, giving him the address of a cheap motel on the outskirts of town. That night, as I lay in the lumpy motel bed, I finally allowed myself to think about what had happened. If Ezekiel Thorne was really dead, and I'd seen his obituary, hadn't I? Then how could he be haunting me? And why? Because I'd denied his life insurance application. It didn't make sense. None of it made sense. A soft knock at the door made me jump. I held my breath, waiting. It came again, more insistent this time. "Mr. Insurance Man," that dry, raspy voice called out. "You can't run forever. Your policy is coming due." I bolted upright, my heart pounding. This couldn't be happening. Not here, not again. The doorknob began to turn. I scrambled out of bed, looking frantically for an escape route. The bathroom window was small, but I was desperate enough to try squeezing through it. As I rushed towards the bathroom, the motel room door creaked open behind me. The smell hit me first, a nauseating mixture of formaldehyde and decay. I slammed the bathroom door shut and locked it, my hands shaking so badly I could barely manage the simple task. The shuffling footsteps grew closer. Now, Ezekiel's voice rasped, just outside the bathroom door. "Is that any way to treat a client? We have a policy to discuss." I turned on the faucet full blast, hoping to drown out his words, but somehow his voice cut through the rush of water, clear as a bell. "You denied me in life, Mr. Insurance Man, but death is a much more accommodating underwriter." The doorknob rattled. I backed away, pressing myself against the small window. It was stuck, decades of paint sealing it shut. I clawed at it desperately, fingernails breaking as I tried to force it open. A bony hand burst through the door, splintering wood as if it were paper. I screamed, a sound of pure terror that I barely recognized as my own. The hand groped around, finding the lock and turning it with a decisive click. As the door swung open, I finally managed to break the window's seal. I didn't even bother to clear away the broken glass before I started to squeeze through the tiny opening. Shards sliced into my skin, but I barely felt the pain. All I could focus on was escape. I tumbled out onto the wet pavement of the motel's back alley, the rain soaking me instantly. I scrambled to my feet and ran, not daring to look back. I ran until my lungs burned and my legs threatened to give out, finally collapsing in a park several miles away. As I sat there, gasping for breath and shivering in the cold rain, I tried to make sense of what was happening. This couldn't go on. I couldn't keep running forever. There had to be a way to end this, to appease the spirit of Ezekiel Thorne. With a sudden clarity, I knew what I had to do. The next morning, I dragged myself into the Everlast Life Insurance office. My colleagues stared as I limped past, clothes torn and stained, face gaunt with exhaustion and fear. I ignored them all, making my way straight to the records room. It took me hours of searching, but I finally found what I was looking for, Ezekiel Thorne's original application. With shaking hands, I pulled out a pen and changed the denied stamp to approved. I filled out all the necessary paperwork, backdating it to before his death. As I signed the final form, I felt a chill run down my spine. Slowly, I turned around. Ezekiel Thorne stood there, a grotesque smile stretching his decayed features. "Well done, Mr. Insurance Man," he wheezed. "But I'm afraid it's too late for that." I blinked, and suddenly I was back in my apartment, sitting at my desk. The insurance papers were gone. In their place was a single document, my own death certificate, dated today. "You see," Ezekiel's voice whispered in my ear, "your policy came due the moment you denied mine. Everything since then, just a grace period." I felt a bony hand on my shoulder, and the world began to fade away. I woke up screaming, tangled in sweat-soaked sheets. My heart was racing, and for a moment, I couldn't remember where I was. As reality slowly seeped back in, I realized I was in my own bed, in my own apartment. It had all been a nightmare, a vivid, terrifying nightmare, but a nightmare nonetheless. Relief washed over me, followed quickly by embarrassment. How could I have let a simple insurance application affect me so deeply? I glanced at the clock, 3:07 a.m. With a sigh, I got up to get a glass of water, hoping it would calm my nerves. As I padded to the kitchen, a floorboard creaked behind me. I flouncy, a chill running down my spine. Slowly, I turned around. The hallway was empty, shadows stretching in the dim light. I let out a shaky laugh. "Get a grip," I told myself. It was just a dream. I turned back towards the kitchen and found myself face to face with Ezekiel Thorne. His pale blue eyes bored into mine, his withered face inches from my own. The smell of formaldehyde was overwhelming. "Sweet dreams, Mr. Insurance Man," he rasped. And then, with a bony finger, he reached out and tapped me on the forehead. I jolted awake, gasping for air. My bedroom was dark and quiet. No sign of any undead visitors, just another nightmare. But as I reached up to wipe the sweat from my brow, my blood ran cold. There, in the center of my forehead, I felt a small, cold spot, exactly where Ezekiel's finger had touched me in my dream. I scrambled out of bed and rushed to the bathroom, flipping on the light. In the mirror, I saw a small, perfectly round bruise forming on my forehead. As I stared at it in horror, I could have sworn I saw pale blue eyes reflecting in the mirror behind me. I whirled around, but the bathroom was empty. When I looked back at the mirror, the eyes were gone, but the bruise remained, a tangible reminder that the line between nightmare and reality was blurring. From that night on, sleep became my enemy. Every time I closed my eyes, Ezekiel was there, waiting. Sometimes he chased me through endless, twisting corridors. Other times, he simply stood and watched. Those pale blue eyes never blinking, always. I woke with new bruises, scratches, or other inexplicable marks. During the day, I was a wreck. I couldn't focus at work, jumping at every sound and seeing Ezekiel's face in every shadow. My colleagues whispered behind my back, their concerned looks following me as I stumbled through the office like a ghost myself. I knew I was losing my grip on reality, but what could I do? Who would believe me if I told them I was being haunted by the ghost of a man whose life insurance application I had denied? As weeks passed, I grew gaunt and hollow-eyed. The boundaries between waking and sleeping, reality and nightmare, became increasingly blurred. I would find myself in strange places with no memory of how I got there, standing on the roof of my apartment building, or in the middle of a graveyard across town. And always, I felt those pale blue eyes watching me. I knew I couldn't go on like this. Something had to give. In desperation, I decided to confront the source of my torment. I would go to Ezekiel Thorne's grave and what? Apologize, beg for forgiveness. I didn't know, but I had to do something. The cemetery was eerily quiet as I made my way through the rows of headstones. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the ground. I shivered, pulling my coat tighter around me. Finally, I found it. A simple granite headstone with the name Ezekiel Thorne carved into it. Below, the dates of his birth and death. And at the bottom, a single line. His claim was denied, but his spirit endures. I stood there, staring at those words as darkness fell around me. What was I doing here? What did I hope to accomplish? "I'm sorry," I whispered, feeling foolish but desperate. "I'm sorry I denied your application. I was just doing my job. Please, please leave me alone." The wind picked up, rustling the leaves of nearby trees. For a moment, I thought I heard a whisper on the breeze. "Too late, Mr. Insurance Man. Far too late." I turned to leave, my heart heavy with the realization that this had all been for nothing. But as I took a step away from the grave, the ground beneath my feet suddenly gave way. I fell, tumbling into darkness. The smell of damp earth filled my nostrils as I landed hard on something solid. As I lay there, winded and disoriented, I heard a sound that made my blood run cold. The scrape of wood on wood, like a coffin lid being slowly opened. A bony hand emerged from the darkness, gripping my ankle as I was dragged deeper into the earth. The last thing I saw was a pair of pale blue eyes, gleaming with triumph. "Welcome," Ezekiel's raspy voice echoed around me, "to your eternal policy, Mr. Insurance Man. I'm afraid the premiums are quite steep, but don't worry, we have all of eternity to settle the account." The darkness closed in, and I knew that my claim on life had finally been denied. I jolted awake, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst from my chest. The familiar surroundings of my bedroom slowly came into focus, bathed in the soft glow of early morning light. I was drenched in sweat, the sheets tangled around my legs like a burial shroud. For a moment, relief washed over me. It had all been a dream, a horrific, vivid nightmare, but a dream nonetheless. I let out an exhausted laugh, running my hands through my hair. I stumbled out of bed, my legs weak and unsteady. The world seemed to tilt and swim around me as I made my way to the bathroom. I splashed cold water on my face, trying to shake off the lingering tendrils of the nightmare. But when I looked up into the mirror, my blood ran cold. There, reflected in the glass behind me, were a pair of pale blue eyes. I whirled around, my heart in my throat, but the bathroom was empty. When I turned back to the mirror, the eyes were gone once again. I called in sick to work that day, unable to face the thought of dealing with more insurance claims. Instead, I spent hours researching hauntings, exorcisms, anything that might help me understand what was happening. But the more I read, the more hopeless I felt. How could I fight something that shouldn't even exist? As night fell, I found myself dreading sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Ezekiel's withered face, those pale blue eyes boring into my soul. I tried everything to stay awake. Coffee, energy drinks, even slapping myself across the face. But eventually, exhaustion won out, and I drifted off into an uneasy slumber. The dream started as it always did. I was back in the Everlast office, Ezekiel's file open on my desk. But this time, As I reached for the denied stamp, I hesitated. What if I approved it? Would that end this nightmare? With a trembling hand, I picked up the approved stamp instead. As it came down on the paper, I felt a rush of relief. Maybe now it would be over. But as I looked up, Ezekiel was there, his decaying face inches from mine. Too late. "Mr. Insurance Man," he rasped, "your policy has already been cashed in." I woke up screaming, thrashing against the sheets. As I fought to catch my breath, I realized something was different. The room smelled wrong, like formaldehyde and decay. Slowly, I turned my head towards the bedroom door. It was open, and standing in the doorway was a figure I had hoped never to see in the waking world. Ezekiel Thorne shuffled into the room, his movements stiff and unnatural. In the dim light, I could see the waxy sheen of his skin, the sunken hollows of his cheeks, but it was his eyes that held me paralyzed. Those pale blue orbs, now cloudy with death, but still piercing in their intensity. "Did you really think it would be that easy?" he wheezed, his voice like dry leaves skittering across pavement. "That you could simply stamp approved and wash your hands of me?" I tried to speak, to plead, to reason with him, but no sound came out. My body wouldn't respond, pinned to the bed by an unseen force. Ezekiel reached the side of the bed, looming over me. "You denied me in life, Mr. Insurance Man, but death is a far more lenient underwriter. And now, it's time to collect on your policy." He reached out a bony hand, his finger pointing directly at my forehead. I squeezed my eyes shut, bracing for whatever was to come. But the touch never came. Instead, I heard a sound that didn't belong, the shrill ring of a telephone. My eyes snapped open. I was alone in my bedroom, sunlight streaming through the windows. The phone on my nightstand continued to ring insistently. With a shaking hand, I picked it up. "Hello? Mr. Johnson." It was my boss's voice. "Where are you? You were supposed to be here an hour ago for the meeting with the new clients." I glanced at the clock and cursed. I had overslept. "I'm sorry. I'll be right there," I stammered, already scrambling out of bed. As I rushed to get ready, my mind was reeling. Had it all been a dream? But the bruise on my forehead was still there, faded but visible. I made it to the office in record time, sliding into the conference room just as the meeting was starting. As I took my seat, trying to catch my breath, I froze. Sitting across the table, his pale blue eyes locked on mine, was Ezekiel Thorne. He looked different in the harsh, fluorescent light of the office, less corpse-like, more human, but there was no mistaking those eyes. "Mr. Johnson," my boss said, "I'd like you to meet our new client, Mr. Thorne. He's interested in a rather unique life insurance policy." Ezekiel's lips curled into a small smile. "It's a pleasure to meet you, Mr. Insurance Man," he said, his voice dry but devoid of the otherworldly rasp I had come to associate with him. "I have a feeling we're going to be working very closely together." As he reached across the table to shake my hand, I saw the glint of triumph in those pale blue eyes, and I knew, with a sickening certainty, that this was only the beginning. The meeting passed in a blur. I nodded and smiled automatically, my mind racing as I tried to make sense of what was happening. How could Ezekiel be here, alive and well, when I had seen his obituary, when he had haunted my dreams and invaded my waking hours as a decaying corpse? As the other attendees filed out of the room, Ezekiel lingered. He approached me slowly, his movements fluid and natural, nothing like the stiff, shuffling gait of the creature that had haunted me. "Quite a shock, isn't it, Mr. Johnson?" he said softly, those pale blue eyes never leaving mine, "to see the dead walk among the living." I swallowed hard, my mouth suddenly dry. "I don't understand," I managed to croak out. "You were. I saw." Ezekiel's smile widened, revealing teeth that were just a shade too white, too perfect. "Death is not always as final as people believe," he said, "especially for those of us who have certain connections." He leaned in closer, and I caught a whiff of that familiar formaldehyde scent. You denied my claim once, Mr. Insurance Man. But now, I'm offering you a policy of your own, one that will guarantee your safety and sanity. What? What do you want? I whispered, unable to look away from those hypnotic blue eyes. It's simple. Really? Ezekiel replied. You'll be my personal insurance agent from now on. Every policy I bring to you, you'll approve. No questions asked. In return, I'll ensure that your nights are peaceful and your days, well, let's just say you won't have to worry about any unexpected visits. I knew I should refuse. Every instinct screamed that this was wrong, dangerous, but the memory of those endless nightmares, the constant fear and paranoia, was too fresh. Do we have a deal, Mr. Insurance Man? Ezekiel extended his hand, his pale blue eyes gleaming with an otherworldly light. With a sense of finality, I reached out and shook his hand. His skin was cold and dry, like old parchment. Excellent, Ezekiel said, his smile growing impossibly wide. I look forward to a long and profitable relationship. As he turned to leave, he paused at the door. Oh, and Mr. Johnson, sweet dreams. That night, for the first time in weeks, I slept without nightmares. But as I drifted off, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had just signed away something far more valuable than any insurance policy. And in the shadows of my room, I could have sworn I saw a pair of pale blue eyes waiting, as I descended into a dreamless sleep. The weeks that followed were a blur of surreal normalcy. By day, I went through the motions at work, approving every policy that crossed my desk with Ezekiel's name attached. They were always for astronomical sums, always for clients with medical histories that should have disqualified them immediately. But I stamped each one approved without hesitation, the memory of those nightmarish weeks still fresh in my mind. By night, I slept peacefully, undisturbed by visions of decay and whispers of eternity, but the price of this tranquility weighed heavily on my conscience. As the months wore on, I began to notice changes in myself. My reflection in the mirror looked older, somehow, gaunt. There were streaks of grey in my hair that hadn't been there before. It was as if Ezekiel was slowly draining the life from me, one approved policy at a time. It was nearly a year to the day since I'd made my deal when Ezekiel called me into his office. Yes, he had an office now, a corner suite with a view of the city. As I entered, I noticed the smell of formaldehyde was stronger than ever. Ah, Mr. Johnson, he said, those pale blue eyes gleaming. I have a special policy for you today, one I think you'll find particularly interesting. He slid a folder across the desk. With trembling hands, I opened it. Inside was a life insurance application. My life insurance application. As the meaning of his words sank in, I felt a chill run down my spine. This was it, the moment I'd been dreading all along. Ezekiel had never intended to let me go. He was going to claim me, just as he'd claimed all those other poor souls whose policies I'd approved. But in that moment of terror, something inside me snapped. I'd spent my whole career assessing risks, calculating odds, and suddenly I realized Ezekiel's power over me was built on fear that I'd given him willingly. No, I said, my voice stronger than I'd expected. Ezekiel's smile faltered. I beg your pardon. I stood up, looking him directly in those pale blue eyes. I said no, this wasn't part of our deal, and I'm done being afraid of you. For a moment, Ezekiel's facade slipped, revealing the decaying horror beneath. But I held my ground. You have no power over me, I continued, my confidence growing. You're nothing but a parasite, feeding on fear and bureaucracy. Well, I'm cutting you off. I grabbed the file with my application and tore it in half. As the pieces fell to the floor, I felt a surge of energy coursing through me. Ezekiel let out an inhuman shriek, lunging across the desk at me, but his movements were slow, clumsy, as if he was struggling to maintain his form in our world. I dodged his grasping hands and ran for the door. As I threw it open, I shouted to the stunned office beyond. Everyone, listen, don't approve any more of his policies. He has no power if we don't give it to him. Chaos erupted in the office. Some people screamed, others looked confused, but I saw understanding dawn in a few faces, those who, like me, had been haunted by nightmares of pale blue eyes and the smell of formaldehyde. As I ran through the building, shouting my warning, I heard Ezekiel's enraged howls behind me, but with each person who listened, each policy that was questioned instead of blindly approved, his voice grew fainter. I burst out of the building into the sunlight, gasping for breath. For a moment, I thought I saw Ezekiel's withered face in the reflection of a nearby window, those pale blue eyes filled with impotent rage, but then it was gone, fading like a bad dream in the morning light. In the days that followed, there was an investigation. Hundreds of fraudulent policies were uncovered, all traced back to the mysterious Ezekiel Thorne, who seemed to have vanished into thin air. The company underwent a major overhaul, with a new emphasis on ethical practices and thorough vetting. As for me, I slept peacefully for the first time in what felt like years. The nightmares were gone, banished along with the specter of Ezekiel Thorne. I'd learned a valuable lesson about the power of facing your fears and the importance of reading the fine print. Sometimes, on dark nights, I think I catch a whiff of formaldehyde or see a flash of pale blue eyes in the shadows. But I'm not afraid anymore. After all, I know the truth now. No ghost, no matter how malevolent or cunning, can stand against the power of human will and a properly denied insurance claim. I knew it was him from the cologne. It was always the cheap mall kiosk stuff. He swore you couldn't tell the difference. I never had the heart to tell him he was wrong. It was about 3 in the morning when I felt him get into bed with me. The king we used to share felt empty without him. I felt the bed shift. I felt someone nuzzle up close to me. I swear I heard him whisper into my ear. "Hey, baby," he cooed. "I'm here now." I rolled over to kiss him. I needed this. Of course, there was nobody there. Jack had died 3 months ago in this apartment of a drug overdose. We met in our early 20s, me being a fresh young gay on Grindr, newly out of the closet and wondering why so many people wanted to party. Enter Jack. Someone who had spent his time and left said, "Party." He was more versed than me in life experience by a mile. Homeless at 16 by parents who wouldn't accept him, Jack fell into what most kicked-out gays do, a life of drugs and alcohol. He grew up fast, grew up hard, and was exposed to things a kid his age shouldn't have been. I'm not making excuses. He made a lot of bad choices too. A jail stint and court-ordered rehab set him straight. Thankfully, things were good, or so I had thought. 6 months ago, I noticed changes in him. He was run down, tired. He repeatedly said he couldn't sleep and had nightmares. I thought he was overworked. He had found himself a great construction gig and was fond of overtime. It helped keep his head on straight, he'd say. 3 months ago, I came back to our apartment to find him slouched over on our couch. His face was contorted into a scene of painful shock. I panicked. I don't know what happened next. My memories just flash a bit, like a slideshow after this. 911 was called. The doctors and coroners were stumped. All signs point to a heart attack. I overheard one EMT say sourly after I divulged Jack's drug history that the drug use finally caught up with him. True or not, I almost punched her in the face. Time stopped for me after that for a while. I had to put on the funeral. It was a lot for me. I felt like I was covered in molasses. I don't remember how it went. I think it was a small turnout, mostly co-workers, all very sympathetic, of course. I can't remember much of that first month. I was too deep in my grief. I was struck with a fever twice. I could barely get out of bed. I'm sure it was a combination of the depression as well. That month was brutal. I couldn't find a reason to get out of bed most days. I started snapping out of it when the noises started. Bumps in the middle night, shuffling, doors closing and opening, footsteps. I wasn't sleeping most nights. I couldn't. The noises occurred with too much frequency to give me a respite. I thought I was going crazy until the night the bathroom faucet turned on. I shuffled out of the bed, groggy and half asleep. I got to the closed bathroom door and tried to open it. Locked. The light was on and something was casting a shadow. I knock. Clear as day, I hear Jack's voice. Hold on, babe. I'm almost done. I slam the door open. His toothbrush falls from mid-air to the ground. The sink turns off. There's a large thump behind me. I didn't sleep that night. Noises continued. Whispers. A few nights later is when he climbs into bed with me. I haven't told anyone about that yet. What would they say? It's grief. It will pass. You still feel him around you. I didn't want to hear that bullshit. I knew what I felt. He was in bed with me. The dreams came next, and that should have been my first warning in retrospect. They were so beautiful. Could you fault me? Put yourself in my shoes. They started out as memories of the good times he and I had together. The first date at a bowling alley. The first kiss at the drive-in theater. The times he knew I would hold dear to me. They were incredibly vivid. Then, he started addressing me. First briefly, not much. Just vague feelings or concepts of conversations we had in those memories. Talking about the tiny things you never knew you'd miss talking about. Like corn dogs from a county fair. I wasn't sure whether or not those conversations happened. They were always foggy memories of the best times. But they got increasingly more and more specific. Sleep got worse. If it wasn't Jack visiting my dreams, it was the noises he'd create at night. I began to feel ill again. One night, he came to me in a dream. He took my hand, looked me in the eye, and began to cry. God, I've missed you, he sobbed. It was the first time he seemed to acknowledge what happened. He leaned, kissed me gently on the lips. He hugged me, and that cheap, familiar cologne scent filled my nostrils. I felt a tear go down my cheek. I missed this. He leaned closed, and I felt his breath in my ear as he whispered the words that snapped me awake. You should come with me. I woke up in a cold sweat. I could taste his lips on mine. The words and implications still lingered in my mind. I loved him. I was young and naive. Sure, but he was my first. You remember that kind of love, right? I know now that life goes on, but during that time, for reasons I find out later, his words grabbed me. What was so good about being without him anyway? The noises persisted. He kept visiting, asking again for me to join him. The request getting heavier and heavier to ignore. I wanted to ask about what he meant, but I couldn't, or I guess didn't need to. I knew what it meant. I didn't want to admit it to myself at the time that it was a possibility. I barely slept. When I did, I wasn't rested. I felt like the Walking Dead already. Is that why I'm seeing Jack everywhere? I didn't tell anyone about it. I didn't want to hear their conventional wisdom bullshit about grief. The thing that concerned me the most was the sleepwalking. I never did it in the 32 years of my life. And suddenly it starts when my dead boyfriend decides to visit. Go figure. I'd wake up in precarious positions. Never in deadly danger, but just enough where a wrong turn or a fall would break an arm. Things escalated one night. I would have died had it not been for gravy. Jack was in my dreams again, where we're at the county fair. We were holding hands and staring dumbfounded in different ways at the rides put up the night before. Jack had always loved them. I think it helped speak to a bit of the risk-taker in him. He loved theme parks and roller coasters to death. I wouldn't dare. I was a notorious scaredy cat. He asked me why I wasn't smiling like I used to. He knew the answer. I know you're tired and scared, he said, rubbing my hand with both of his. But I need you to answer soon. I don't know much longer I can visit like this. It didn't occur to me that he may be doing this on borrowed time. My eyes land on the tilt-a-whirl nearby, and he clocks this. His face lights up. Please, I don't know how much longer I'm here, he asked between yanking my hand towards the ride. Give me this. Just this. Please. It's not that scary, I think. I feel a yank on my hand and I take a step forward. I feel something dart between my legs. And the next thing I know, I'm face-planting in the street in the middle of night. I roll over, dazed, and my eyes turn to my savior. Not only 3 feet away was a small grey cat, with specks of black all over him. He had what looked like a slightly torn right ear, and let out what could have been the deepest meow I think I've ever heard from a cat. It sounded like the guy smoked a pack a day. He was thin, but not deathly thin. He either had a neighborhood route of friends to feed him, or was an adept hunter. I heard the honk and instantly got out of the street just in time for a minivan to barrel down the road. I stared, dumbfounded, registering the chain of events. I clearly sleptwalk into danger. This is bad. Did Jack lead me here? I felt my head get dizzy. The ball of fur that saved my life rubbed itself on my legs. Purring, it snapped me back to reality. I looked down at him, and he looked back at me, expectedly. It was 3 a.m. I was tired. Everything felt heavy, but I looked down at this guy, and I knew not to fight it. I walked back to my place, and sure as a shit, he followed suit, meowing loudly and what sounded suspiciously cranky at the same time. I walked inside, and he followed instantly. I have a cat now. This is how these things happen. I've heard of the cat distribution system. In the dark of it all, I had a light, and his name was Gravy. He looked like gravy. Your pet name isn't any better. He was healthy as far as I could tell, neutered already, which meant he had experience with people, good or bad. He was skittish, but I knew that was to be expected. It's not my first cat rodeo. I had him set up with the proper kit within the next few days, and his shots scheduled. Curiously, the one spot he reacted the most negatively to was the spot where Jack had died. He got on his haunches and hissed, but let it be. My brain didn't register the possibility as to why until later. Gravy was the thing that kept me going. He gave me a reason. He was just the right mixture of affectionate and cranky aloofness I needed in a cat. I needed Gravy because Jack wouldn't let up. The dreams took a more urgent tone. The first time he returned, I told him of my accident and he swore he didn't do anything. He said that his time was limited. I had to make my decision because he's getting pulled away somewhere. He claimed we wouldn't be together unless I left with him before he got pulled. Nobody would love you like me. The noises got more frequent and violent. Gravy saved my sanity during those times. He'd register and clock them too, often reacting with a hiss and a growl and some curiosity. The noises were loud. Plates would shatter against the wall often. I didn't give a damn about setting up cameras to capture it. People would say I'm faking it anyways. The dreams got worse. The color would fade, and Jack would appear with much more urgency each time. Sometimes, his face was slightly off, like his skin was stretched just a little too tight. The smell of his cologne became tinged with dirt and soil. He would exclaim, frightened, how his time was up. He could make it quick. He could help end things painlessly, he promised. I couldn't answer. I later came to realize that if you're asked point blank if you want to die or not, and you can't answer, you don't want to die. He paced in front of me, clearly agitated. This was the first time I've ever seen this version of him angry. It frightened me. I felt myself get warm. You chose a cat over me, he yelled. He took a few aggressive steps forward and grabbed my shoulders. I screamed. His hands burned my shoulders to the touch. He came close to my face and saw bits of bone exposed by his too tight facial skin. His breath made me gag. You will come with me. His jaw unhinged as if to swallow me whole, and I woke up screaming. I didn't startle Gravy, who was watching the side of the room, growling. His fur was up. He hissed at something, but I couldn't see what. I felt a wave of tiredness hit me like a brick, and I fell asleep again. The second I closed my eyes, there's the smell. It's his cologne. I was dreaming. I knew it. But this wasn't like the others. The color was back. Things felt like the way they were supposed to be, not some strange hellscape uncanny valley. I was in a version of our bedroom from our earlier days, asleep. I was in bed, facing the wall. When I heard the door open, I felt the bed shift, much more weight than it'd be if it were Gravy. I felt fingertips along my back. His touch didn't burn like it did before. It felt Ellicourt Rick. I got goosebumps. He breathed on the back of my neck and the hairs stood up. He lightly nibbled my ear. I knew in my heart that this wasn't real. I didn't care. I hadn't been touched since Jack. You don't realize how starved you are for touch until you got a plate of food in front of you. I pressed my back against him and I heard him laugh. He rolled on top of me and smiled. He was just as beautiful as the day I met him. He leaned down to kiss with me, such a passion I've never experienced. It took me by surprise how much I needed this moment. Maybe he was right. I felt the pressure in my temples. I felt my lungs begin to struggle as he forced his tongue down my throat. Part of me was screaming to fight back. It was drowned out by just how good it felt to be touched by him. It was comforting. My body began to spasm. I looked Jack in the eyes and saw that his pupils had turned jet black. I felt his tongue begin to swell in my throat as air became harder and harder to acquire. A long, guttural growl cut through the dream like a knife. A hiss. I felt Jack's weight shift. I heard him scream. Instantly, I snapped back awake. I was back in my normal bedroom. Awake. Still with something on me, but I'm not sure what. I couldn't register or understand what Gravy was doing floating on top of me. He was attacking something. That much was clear. He bit down hard on something, which roared out in pain. Flecks of brown ooze or liquid seemed to splash out of the bite wounds Gravy was inflicting on it. Something connected with my jaw. It felt like a sledgehammer, and I fell off the bed and stumbled back up against the wall. I couldn't process what I was seeing. Gravy was clearly still attached to and attacking something in midair that clearly took up space, but I couldn't see it fully. He growled. I noticed some cuts on Gravy's stomach. Suddenly, Gravy was flung up against the wall, and I felt something cold and very strong grasp my neck and squeeze. Without missing a beat, Gravy was suddenly on the thing again. The grip let up on my neck and I gasped out for air. I heard a yowl, and suddenly Gravy was flung against the wall and held there. He thrashed out but was stuck. Something was holding him. It was squeezing him to death. Whatever holding him was growing more and more visible from the cuts and gashes Gravy had been inflicting on it. Whatever illusions I had faded. Jack was killing my cat, and I was next. I felt a stream of urine go down my leg. I started to get dizzy. In that instant, Gravy made eye contact with me. His face became very strained, focused, and he meowed twice, and that snapped me into action. I thought about it later. I know this sounds crazy, but I know what I heard. Gravy spoke and said 2 words. Not Jack. Fight kicked in. I had little in the way of weapons, till my eyes fell upon a framed photo of Jack and I kept on my nightstand. I lunged for it and bring it down on my nightstand, shattering the glass cover. I grabbed the largest shard without even thinking, not registering the horrible cut I had until later. I lunged for the space between Gravy and me and jabbed the shard of glass into the air. It connects with a wet thud, spurting that same brown liquid into the air. Gravy falls to the ground. More bits of whatever was harassing us slowly begin to take form from the shard of glass until it becomes completely revealed. Whatever fight is in me absolutely flees at the rotting corpse in front of me. Dressed in the rotting clothes I buried Jack in, he growled at me. Is dead. Black eyes rolled around lifelessly in his skull. My eyes began to water at the smell, and this thing laughed at me, wheezing. It held the shard of glass in its hand, covered in its own ooze, and swiped at me. I held my forearm up just in time to catch the cut. Neither had noticed Gravy reposition himself between us. Completely visible now, the Jack thing lunged at me again. Before it could finish its swing, Gravy was on its throat. The force of the tackle took it by surprise, and it stumbled backward. Gravy tore and gnashed at the thing's throat, coating himself in the same gunk that poured out of it. Its rotting hands grabbed at Gravy to pull him away, but Gravy held strong. I didn't hesitate this time. I tore the shard of glass away from the thing and shoved it down the other side of its throat. Back and forth. I felt the fire burn in my hand from the cuts of holding it tight, but adrenaline kicked in. I didn't care. All I cared about was working on the other side of this monster's neck while my cat got the other. The thing struggled, but we had the upper hand. I hacked away at rotting muscle and flesh until finally I felt it was good enough. I stood up and positioned myself above the thing and grabbed onto its temples. Any resemblance of Jack was gone. It was just a rotting mess of flesh now, roaring in pain. I didn't know if it'd work, but it felt right. I planted my knees on his shoulders and pulled its head away from his body with as much force as I could muster. It didn't require much force at all, and I overcompensated, landing on my butt against my nightstand, the lifeless head of the rotting corpse still in my hands. The thing's body thrashed less and less before it stopped. I held the head in my hands, feeling the activity slowly begin to die inside it too. I felt the familiar fur and purr against my legs as Gravy nuzzled against me. "Good boy," I said. I dropped the head on the ground. I should have been surprised when it slowly turned to ash and began to crumble, but I don't think much would have surprised me anymore. The body slowly followed suit. I eyed Gravy, and then my own hand, and promptly decided on the hospital for both of us. Gravy required multiple stitches. I told the vets he protected me from a wild animal. Technically, I don't think I was wrong. He was bruised and beat up, but must have been a fighter, the vet claimed. She had no idea. I required stitches as well. My hands and forearms were pretty sliced up. I eagerly showed my stitches to Gravy the second I could. I'd like to think there was a bit of camaraderie there. He sniffed them and promptly showed me his butt and took a nap. I slept like a rock the night after. Any sort of physical unwellness was gone. The apartment was quiet, but I couldn't stay. Of course I couldn't. I had to move on. I couldn't hold on hope that there's even a fraction of Jack left. We moved out shortly after. One ghost was enough. Was it even a ghost? Did Gravy know I was in danger? Did he come to me specifically? Did I really hear Gravy speak English to me that night? I Saturday down and asked him. As crazy as it sounded, I sat Gravy on the kitchen table, and I asked him if he said "not Jack" that night. The air stunk. He farted and hopped off the table. I left it at that. I know I feel safer with him around. This dumb, cranky ball of fur saved my life twice. I did some research after that. I didn't realize that cats essentially domesticated themselves. I had known about how various cultures had cherished them as magical creatures, but pulling themselves out of the food chain by getting domesticated is crazy to me, unless they did it to protect us from things they can see that we can't. I don't like to think about it. I also don't like to think about the one door in my hallway Gravy always stops to hiss at when we come back from our walks. The neighbor who lives there is a female college student who lives alone, whom I've heard sobbing with surprising intensity often, to the point where I've idly wondered if something was wrong. Something felt wrong. I didn't want to admit it. I don't like to think about the rapid, familiar thumping I hear from her apartment sometimes. I don't like to think about this time Gravy stopped at the door and look up at me to ask me with his eyes, "Hey, we doing this or what?" I took a step away from the door, but Gravy held firm. I eyed him. Nobody will believe me, but this sly bastard nodded at me. I took a deep breath, rolled my eyes, and knocked. "Are you okay? Do you need help?" It started as a simple road trip. I had a few days off work and decided to drive across the state to visit an old friend. The plan was to take the scenic route, avoid the interstates, and enjoy the open road. I had my GPS set, snacks packed, and a playlist ready. It was supposed to be a relaxing drive, but somewhere along the way, I took a wrong turn, and that's when everything changed. I'd been driving for hours when my GPS started acting up. The screen flickered, and the route kept recalculating. Frustrated, I pulled over to the side of the road to reset it. I was in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by dense woods and the occasional farmhouse. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows over the road. After fiddling with the GPS for a few minutes, it finally seemed to be working again. It rerouted me down a narrow, winding road that I didn't remember seeing on the map. But I trusted the technology more than my own sense of direction, so I followed it. The road grew narrower and the trees thicker as I drove on. The sunlight faded, and a thick fog began to roll in, reducing visibility to just a few feet in front of my car. I turned on my headlights and slowed down, hoping I would find a way back to the main road soon. After what felt like an eternity, the fog lifted slightly, revealing an old, rusted sign by the side of the road. Welcome to Ravenwood. I had never heard of the place, and a quick glance at my GPS showed no record of it. Still, the idea of a small town where I could get my bearings and maybe ask for directions was appealing. I drove into Ravenwood and immediately felt a chill run down my spine. The town looked like it had been abandoned for years. The buildings were old and decaying, windows boarded up or broken, weeds grew through the cracks in the pavement, and there wasn't a single car or person in sight. I parked my car in front of what used to be a diner and got out. The air was cold and damp, and the silence was almost deafening. I decided to check the diner first, hoping to find someone who could tell me where I was and how to get back on track. The door to the diner creaked loudly as I pushed it open. Inside, it was dark and musty. The tables and chairs were covered in a thick layer of dust, and the smell of mold hung in the air. I called out, but there was no response. The place was empty. Feeling uneasy, I decided to leave and try another building. Across the street was a small grocery store. The windows were covered in grime, but I could see faint light flickering inside. I crossed the street and tried the door. It was locked. As I stood there, contemplating my next move, I heard a sound behind me. I turned around, but there was no one there. Just the empty street and the fog slowly creeping back in. My heart was racing now. Something was very wrong with this place. I walked back to my car, the feeling of being watched growing stronger with each step. I decided to leave Ravenwood and find another route, but as I reached for the car door, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. My car tires were slashed. Panic set in. I was stranded in an abandoned town with no way out. I pulled out my phone to call for help, but there was no signal. Desperate, I decided to search the town for a working phone or someone who could help me. I walked through the empty streets, the sense of dread growing with each step. Every building I tried was either locked or empty. The town was a ghost town, yet I couldn't shake the feeling that I was not alone. As I approached the town square, I saw a figure standing in the middle of the road. It was a man, tall and thin, dressed in old-fashioned clothes. He was staring directly at me. I called out to him, but he didn't respond. He just stood there, motionless. I approached cautiously, my heart pounding in my chest. When I was about 10 feet away, the man turned and walked down an alleyway. I hesitated for a moment before deciding to follow him. He was the first sign of life I had seen, and I needed answers. The alleyway was narrow and dark, the walls covered in peeling paint and graffiti. The man was nowhere to be seen. As I walked deeper into the alley, I heard whispers all around me, faint and indistinct. I spun around, but there was no one there. My footsteps echoed in the narrow space, and the whispers grew louder. They seemed to be coming from all directions. I quickened my pace, hoping to reach the end of the alley and find the man. But instead, I found myself in front of an old, decrepit church. The door to the church was slightly ajar, and a faint light glowed from inside. I pushed the door open and stepped in. The interior was dark and cold, the pews covered in dust and cobwebs. At the far end of the church, near the altar, I saw the man kneeling in prayer. I approached him slowly, my footsteps echoing in the silent church. As I got closer, I noticed that he was whispering something under his breath. I couldn't make out the words, but they sent a shiver down my spine. "Excuse me," I said, my voice trembling. "Can you help me? I'm lost." The man stopped whispering and slowly turned his head to look at me. His eyes were empty and hollow, and his face was gaunt and pale. He didn't say anything, just stared at me with those vacant eyes. I took a step back, fear gripping me. "Please, I need help," I repeated. The man stood up slowly, his movements stiff and unnatural. He pointed towards the back of the church, where a door led to what looked like a small office. Without a word, he walked towards the door and disappeared inside. I hesitated for a moment before following him. The office was small and cluttered, with old books and papers strewn everywhere. The man was standing by a desk, looking at an old rotary phone. He picked it up and handed it to me. I took the phone, relieved to finally have a way to call for help. I dialed 911, but there was no dial tone. The line was dead. I looked at the man, but he just stared at me with those empty eyes. "Is there another phone?" I asked, desperation creeping into my voice. He shook his head slowly and pointed to a piece of paper on the desk. I picked it up and saw that it was a map of the town. There was a red X marked on a building near the edge of town. Scribbled next to the X were the words, "Help here." I looked back at the man, but he was gone. The office door was closed, and I was alone. My hands were shaking as I folded the map and put it in my pocket. I had no choice but to go to the marked building and hope for the best. I left the church and followed the map to the edge of town. The building marked with the red X was an old factory, its windows broken and walls covered in ivy. The front door was slightly open, and I could see a faint light inside. I entered the factory, the air thick with dust and the smell of decay. The light was coming from a room at the far end of the building. I made my way through the dark, empty halls, the whispers following me every step of the way. When I reached the room, I saw a group of people standing in a circle. They were dressed in the same old-fashioned clothes as the man in the church, and they were all whispering the same indistinct words. In the center of the circle was a large, ornate mirror. One of the people, a woman with long, dark hair, looked up as I entered. She smiled, but it was a cold, empty smile that sent chills down my spine. "Welcome," she said in a voice that echoed unnaturally. "We've been waiting for you." I took a step back, but the door behind me slammed shut. The people in the circle began to chant louder, their voices rising in a haunting melody. The mirror in the center of the room started to glow, a faint blue light emanating from its surface. "Please, I just want to leave," I pleaded, my voice barely audible over the chanting. The woman stepped forward, her smile never wavering. "You can't leave," she said. "Not yet. You have to see." She grabbed my arm and pulled me towards the mirror. I tried to resist, but her grip was surprisingly strong. As I got closer, I saw my reflection in the mirror, but it was distorted and twisted. My face looked gaunt and hollow, my eyes empty and lifeless. "What is this?" I asked, panic rising in my chest. The woman leaned in close, her breath cold against my ear. "This is the truth," she whispered. "This is who you are." I tried to pull away, but the chanting grew louder, and the mirror's light intensified. I felt a cold, dark presence envelop me, and my vision started to blur. The last thing I saw before everything went black was my reflection in the mirror, smiling back at me with that same empty, hollow smile. When I woke up, I was lying on the side of the road, my car parked nearby. The sun was rising, and the fog had lifted. I scrambled to my feet, my heart pounding. Was it all just a dream? I checked my car, and to my relief, the tires were intact. My phone had a signal, and the GPS was working fine. I quickly got in the car and drove away, not daring to look back. As I drove, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The memories of Ravenwood haunted me, and I couldn't get the image of my distorted reflection out of my mind. Eventually, I reached my friend's house, but I didn't tell anyone about what happened. Who would believe me? Days passed, but the experience lingered in my thoughts. One night, I found an old box of family photos while rummaging through the attic. As I sifted through the pictures, one in particular caught my eye. It was a sepia-toned photograph of a small town that looked eerily familiar. In the background, I could see a sign that read Ravenwood. In the foreground stood a group of people dressed in old-fashioned clothes, their faces hauntingly vacant. My heart nearly stopped when I recognized one of the faces. It was the woman from the factory, her cold, empty smile unmistakable. Standing next to her, with the same hollow eyes, was a younger version of the man from the church. And there, in the middle of the group, was a boy with a familiar face. It was me. I dropped the photo, my hands trembling. The realization hit me like a cold wave. Ravenwood wasn't just a random, sinister town. It was part of my past, a forgotten piece of my history, and somehow it had called me back. To this day, I still don't know what Ravenwood truly is, or why it isn't on any map. But one thing is certain, it's part of me, and I'll never escape its haunting presence. As I look into the mirror now, I sometimes catch a glimpse of that empty, hollow smile, and I wonder if, one day, I'll find myself back in Ravenwood, where I truly belong. Thank you for venturing into the darkness with us. If you dare to explore further, be sure to subscribe to our channel for more spine-tingling tales of horror and the supernatural. Remember, the shadows hold endless mysteries, waiting to be unveiled. Stay tuned for more bone-chilling stories as we continue to traverse the eerie depths of the unknown together. Until next time, may your dreams be free from the haunting echoes of our tales. Or perhaps not.